Some moments feel much bigger from the inside than they ever looked from the outside. Brief pause, one ordinary social cue lands with just enough uncertainty to make the mind start overreading it. You know the feeling. That is when the mind starts treating a private reaction like public evidence. Then the inside story arrives fast. A small inner reaction starts looking like a shared public conclusion. The cues around overthinking and gets and louder, and after feel more decisive than they really are. And the body reacts as if the room has already agreed on what it means. That is the part most people never say out loud. The feeling becomes public inside the mind before anything public has actually happened. That is where the mind fills uncertainty with an emotionally convincing social story. That question matters, because once the viewer can see how the mind fills uncertainty with an emotionally convincing social story, the room starts feeling smaller, and the next section can slow the reaction down instead of letting it harden into the only story available. A cleaner way to say it is this: private tension is not the same thing as public attention. That keeps the opening human and immediate, instead of abstract. That question matters, because the next section can slow the room back down and show how the interpretation starts forming in real time. It starts in the body before it turns into a story. More slowly, a minor pause or glance lands awkwardly, and your interpretation outruns the evidence before anything public has happened. Nothing dramatic has happened, but the body is already bracing for a social consequence. This is where the distortion starts to feel believable. A small inner reaction starts looking like a shared public conclusion, even though the room itself is still giving off mixed, unfinished, and mostly ordinary cues. Outside, the scene stays small. Inside, the mind starts filling uncertainty with a harsher social story. The mind starts writing a story faster than the room is providing evidence for one. That is why moments like this linger. A question-driven moment becomes emotionally loaded before anyone else has clearly reacted, and the body starts preparing for a social conclusion that may not exist. In a moment like this, attention starts sticking to the one cue that feels threatening. That is why the scene starts feeling sharper, brighter, and more socially decisive than it really is. A cleaner way to say it is this: private tension is not the same thing as public attention. Inside a scene, that line matters, because the viewer can feel the exaggeration building in real time. The lived version still matters most here. The mind starts filling uncertainty with a harsher social story, especially when the private story starts feeling more certain than the room itself. Notice how quickly neutral details become charged inside the scene. A pause starts feeling deliberate, a face starts looking informative, and silence begins carrying more meaning than it actually has. The moment usually turns on a tiny delay. That is where a small inner reaction starts looking like a shared public conclusion, long before the room has offered anything close to a clear public conclusion. The scenario also benefits from contrast. The outer scene is mundane, but the internal response is already behaving as if the room reached a shared conclusion. That mismatch matters, because it gives the viewer something concrete to carry into the explanation. The scene stays ordinary. The interpretation is what keeps expanding. A little ambiguity is what makes the moment feel true. If every face or cue becomes too explicit, the audience loses the feeling of how easily the mind can overcomplete the story. That is why everyday texture matters so much here. A realistic pause, glance, or stumble does more work than a dramatic scene the viewer would never confuse with their own life. The viewer can feel that the scene stayed small all the way through. What changed was the interpretation, not the amount of public evidence sitting in the room. That is also what makes the moment reusable outside this one topic. Once the audience can feel the inflation happening inside an ordinary scene, they can recognize the same inflation in future social situations without needing the exact same trigger. From there, the next section can explain the distortion without losing the human reality of the moment. The explanation starts getting cleaner here. Brief pause, the feeling is private. The conclusion feels public. And the mind starts confusing the two. That is the mechanism. The mind fills uncertainty with an emotionally convincing social story. A cue lands, its meaning inflates, and the inflated meaning gets read back into other people's faces. The reason it feels so convincing is not that the mind is irrational. In the social behavior space, discomfort becomes persuasive when uncertainty is high and attention narrows around a possible social threat. You can see the shift in how one small cue starts carrying more meaning than the rest of the room. Under social uncertainty, attention and self-monitoring can make an ordinary cue feel heavier than it is. The nervous system is trying to end uncertainty quickly, not trying to embarrass the viewer. That matters because the feeling is real. The public conclusion is not automatically real. A cleaner way to explain the mechanism is this: the feeling that everyone is noticing more than they really are. In psychology, this is often described as spotlight effect. Attention starts sticking to the one cue that feels threatening, that keeps the concept section precise, without sounding like a lecture. A cleaner way to say it is this: private tension is not the same thing as public attention. In the concept section, that line works, because it separates the feeling from the conclusion without flattening either one. The pattern gets clearer when the viewer remembers that the mind is solving an uncertainty problem, not deliberately inventing nonsense. It would rather reach a fast explanation than stay open and unprotected. That fast explanation is exactly where the brain compresses uncertainty into something that feels much more certain than it is. Once the interpretation lands, memory starts polishing it until the scene feels more unanimous than it ever was. Another useful layer is that the way people start monitoring themselves changes perception while it is happening. The more the viewer scans themselves, the easier it becomes to believe that other people are scanning them too. Seen this way, the mechanism is less about drama and more about compression. A complicated room gets reduced into one emotionally convincing story, and that story is usually harsher than the room itself. That is why naming the mechanism matters so much. It separates the intensity of the feeling from the authority of the conclusion, which is the key reframe the rest of the video depends on. Once the viewer can describe the mechanism in plain language, the feeling becomes easier to interrupt later. Naming is not the whole intervention, but it is the first clean reduction in confusion. The usable sequence is simple. Cue, interpretation, watching yourself too closely, a harsher retelling, then exaggerated certainty. Once that sequence is visible, the distortion becomes easier to recognize while it is unfolding. That reduction in confusion matters more than it sounds. Without it, the viewer is forced to argue with the feeling directly. With it, they can start examining the steps that made the feeling sound so authoritative and so immediate in the first place. Seen clearly, the sequence is almost mechanical. A cue lands. The body reacts. Attention narrows. Then the mind starts predicting what the room must have meant before a slower interpretation has time to arrive. One more distinction matters. Intensity is not the same thing as accuracy. The first surge can be completely sincere, while still being a poor estimate of what the rest of the room is actually tracking. Once the mechanism has a name, the next section can show how the same pattern looks when lived from the inside, instead of merely explained. A concrete example makes the distortion easier to see. Brief pause, a small moment passes, but your attention keeps feeding it extra meaning long after the room has moved on. The room keeps moving, but your attention does not. Hours later, the event is still small, but the private retelling is bigger. That difference is the clue. What the example proves is not that the feeling was fake. It proves that a small inner reaction starts looking like a shared public conclusion, and that emotional certainty can arrive long before public evidence does. That is why research and lived experience belong in the same frame here. Both show how the brain starts protecting against a social conclusion that may never have fully existed. What small social moment still feels much bigger in your head than it probably looked from the outside? If you want, leave it in the comments. There is a good chance other people barely remember the moment with the same intensity you do. That is exactly why the next section matters. The useful move is not more self-judgment, but a better way to interrupt the spiral. The example gets stronger once you hear it this way. The body starts bracing for judgment before there is proof of judgment, which is part of what psychology tries to describe with social anxiety. The event and the interpretation are no longer forced to carry the same weight. A cleaner way to say it is this: private tension is not the same thing as public attention. In the example, that line proves the event and the interpretation were never the same thing. The lived version still matters most here. The private story keeps growing more certain than the room ever was, especially when the private story starts feeling more certain than the room itself. The moment becomes clearest when it exposes the interpretation step. It lets the audience see that the event and the story about the event were never identical. That is also why a good example can stay small. It only needs enough specificity to make the private retelling obvious and enough distance to show how little hard evidence was available. In psychology content, examples are doing two jobs at once. They prove the mechanism and they lower shame. The viewer can think, "This is familiar," without feeling mocked by the narration. That combination of proof and recognition is what makes the scene stick. The viewer can imagine how the moment looked from inside the body and from outside the room at the same time. The example becomes even stronger when it quietly shows what did not happen. No one announced a social conclusion. No one froze the room. And yet the viewer still left with a vivid sense of exposure. That asymmetry between event and interpretation is the practical lesson hiding inside the example. Once the audience sees it, they can start noticing the same asymmetry in their own private retellings. The goal is to make the inflation visible without humiliating the viewer. The example proves the mechanism while keeping the voice compassionate. That compassion matters because the audience is usually listening for a way to understand themselves without feeling foolish. A strong example offers that understanding while still preserving explanatory precision. Once the case is clear, the next section can shrink the story back down to something the viewer can interrupt sooner next time. Here is the moment where explanation turns usable. Brief pause, the decision rule is simple. Interrupt. Name. Widens. Evidence. Interrupt. Catch the moment before the feeling turns into a conclusion. Name. Describe the moment in plain language, like a look, a pause, and a small shift in tone that the mind keeps enlarging, instead of describing what it must have meant about you. Widen. Imagine the wider frame again, including how ordinary, unfinished, and distracted the rest of the room probably still was. Evidence. Ask one steady question. What evidence is actually here, and what part of this story arrived from the first interpretation itself? That earlier recognition is where relief starts to feel believable. The story in your head is usually larger than the room itself. Recognition creates enough pause to separate the feeling from the evidence. The room was usually less decisive than the nervous system first assumed, which is exactly why a smaller first interpretation becomes easier to interrupt. The useful shift becomes easier once you can say it in plain language. The feeling that everyone is noticing more than they really are. That gives the viewer one practical second before the feeling hardens into a conclusion. A cleaner way to say it is this: private tension is not the same thing as public attention. That keeps the lesson usable, because it points to the exact second where the interpretation can be interrupted. The most usable closing move is simple. The room gets smaller once the feeling stops posing as evidence. That keeps the advice practical instead of sentimental, which is exactly what the insight section needs. The win is earlier recognition, not emotional perfection. That smaller win matters, because it interrupts the jump from sensation to certainty. Once the pattern is visible, the viewer gets a narrower and more practical question to ask. What evidence is actually here, and what part of this story arrived from the first interpretation itself? This is where explanation turns into relief. The feeling may still arrive, but it no longer gets to arrive wearing the costume of final truth. The tone changes here, without becoming simplistic. The viewer has gained leverage, not proof that the feeling was trivial. A good insight paragraph also changes timing. Instead of noticing the pattern after the private retelling is already running, the viewer starts noticing the setup earlier. That timing shift is the real behavioral payoff. It does not promise perfect calm. It gives the viewer one more beat before the story in their head starts impersonating reality. That smaller timing shift is what makes the advice usable. You do not need perfect confidence. You only need a little more distance before the mind turns discomfort into a public story. From there, the final step is to let the conclusion shrink the story back to human size. The room can return to human size here. More calmly, the story in your head is usually larger than the room itself. The feeling may still be intense, but its certainty is no longer allowed to stand in for evidence. What the viewer carries forward is not a perfect fix. The durable lens is simple. Notice when the mind fills uncertainty with an emotionally convincing social story, and treat that first rush as a real feeling that still needs context, not a public story that already knows what the room decided. The next time the feeling rises, the viewer does not need to believe the first story their fear writes. The ending lands best when the formal label falls away and the human meaning stays. The feeling that everyone is noticing more than they really are. That is what lets the room return to human size. A cleaner way to say it is this: private tension is not the same thing as public attention. That gives the ending a calmer truth the viewer can actually carry into the next moment. The most usable closing move is simple. The room gets smaller once the feeling stops posing as evidence. That leaves the viewer with a concrete emotional reset, instead of one more abstract reassurance. The lesson stays strongest when it stays modest. The goal is not to talk the viewer out of every social feeling, but to keep one feeling from becoming the entire interpretation. That is the deeper reframe of a private feeling starts sounding like public evidence. The mind can make a room feel huge, and understanding that distortion can make the room feel human-sized again. What matters now is that the moment feels less total. The viewer can feel the reaction and still ask what the room was actually offering before turning it into a harsh conclusion. That is the quiet promise of this kind of psychology explanation. Not to flatten emotion, but to keep emotion from claiming more evidence than it actually has. A good ending leaves the viewer steadier than the opening left them. The situation may still matter, but it no longer has to dominate the entire social meaning of the moment. Carry forward one calmer question instead. What actually happened here, and what part of the story arrived from the feeling itself? That matters, because the pause is often enough to let the room return to human size before the old certainty